Christ according to Luke.
Glory to you, Lord Christ.
On one occasion, when Jesus was going to the house of a leader of the Pharisees to eat a meal on the Sabbath, they were watching him closely. When he noticed how the guests chose the place of honor, he told them a parable. When you are invited by someone to a wedding banquet, do not sit down at the place of honor, in case someone more distinguished than you has been invited by your host. And the host who invited both of you may come and say to you, give this person your place, and then in disgrace you would start to take the lowest place. But when you are invited, go and sit down at the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he may say to you, friend, move up higher. Then you will be honored in the presence of all who sit at the table with you. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. He said also to the one who had invited him, when you give a luncheon or a dinner, do not invite your friends or your brother or your relatives or rich neighbors, in case they may invite you in return and you would be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind, and you will be blessed because they cannot repay you. For you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. The gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Christ.
Do not put yourselves forward in the king's presence, or stand in the place of the great, for it is better to be told, come up here, than to be put lower in the presence of a noble. That comes from Proverbs. Clearly, Jesus is quoting Proverbs, paraphrasing it perhaps, but he is in meal, in supper, at dinner with the gathered people on the Sabbath day. There's a small part that our reading left out. He actually does a healing miracle at the very beginning of this. You'll remember last week, the controversy was healing on the Sabbath and what worth we have as human beings, far greater than the animals that labor. And so there was the controversy last week. It repeats again this week in this same setting, although we're in a different village, a different city. There's a lot of movement going on in Luke. Jesus is still moving towards Jerusalem. And he finds himself in the third dinner event, according to Luke. He's a rock star. He's popular. He's an A-lister. Everybody wants Jesus. But why? They want to trap him. They want to somehow prove that what he is saying is either against Torah or against Midrash, but certainly not a part of what proper Judaism would have. Being the rabbi that he is, he always responds with caustic tones. Our second reading began with, do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for by doing that, some have entertained angels without knowing it. Isn't that lovely? And how true that is. So you heard the practical response of Jesus to the gathering. Don't go sit at the head of the table. sit at the end of the table so that you can be invited up. He was giving them practical advice to people that were coming there based on Proverbs, as we heard. But he turns that even on its head. Because what he was illustrating for them in his own subversive way was that competing for honor includes competing for humility. If you intentionally sit in the least place so that you can sit in the best place, what are you doing? Jesus is pretty clever. He illustrates it, then he destroys it. And where does he destroy it? In the last lines of our reading today. When you give a luncheon or a dinner, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your sisters or relatives or rich neighbors, in case they may invite you in return, and you would be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind, and you will be blessed, because they cannot repay you. For you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. Everything that preceded that is turned on its head. Jesus very cleverly sucks them in and then slams them for their competition. I know some of you all probably know people, and you've heard the phrase, the thing I'm most proud of is my humility. Right? We've heard that. Jesus has a great deal of concern with that and does a lot of teaching about humility. I'll give you a couple of sound bites of his teaching. Do not look like the one that is wearing long phylacteries over there, oiling his hair. Do not look like the one that covers himself in ashes and moans in public. No, I say, pray to your Father in solitude and private. Now, he doesn't mean go hide in a closet to pray, or if you have little children, go to the bathroom and pray. That might also work for those of you that own puppy dogs. What he's saying is experience and shift your very personhood to true humility, which is not self-deprecating, but it honors the other. It says that I'm simply doing the work that Jesus has put about for me to do. When I was in the Navy, we had to really square away our bunks in a certain way, at least in boot camp. And they had to be tight, and the corners had to be hospital corners. And during inspection, some grizzly old guy would come walking down the aisle with a 50-cent piece and flap it on your bunk to see if it would flip up. If it didn't, it wasn't tight enough, and he would take the whole mattress and throw it on the floor and say, do it again. But then when you did it right, what did you get? Oh, you did your job. Jesus says, do your job. Simply, do your job. And your job is what? To break down barriers, to lower thresholds. We're having a big conversation in the United States of America about voting and voting rights and access, aren't we? When will we lower the thresholds so that a whole community can determine its future, irrespective of who you might be, or what you might be, or how you identify? But it's not just voting. It is living. Jesus says in his last line, do your job. Reach out to those who don't have much, if anything. Spiritually, financially, physically, reach out. There's so many people hungry, aren't there? How many of you hunger and thirst for the love of Christ? How many of you will not forgive yourselves sufficiently to allow that beauty to come into your spirit and your soul? Do your work. Allow yourself to be loved and learn to love yourself. You all have gifts. Gifts of prophecy, gifts of teaching, gifts of good work, gifts of humor and wit. Luigi keeps me laughing before Mass. And he brings wit into the world that needs to laugh more. Ed brings beauty to the service as he moves around. My, he's a handsome man. Beauty, let it flow out. Do not be embarrassed to say that. I acknowledge he is a handsome man. He is beautiful. But I would say to you also, you are beautiful. You're crafted in such unique, amazing ways. No two of you all are alike. Isn't that magnificent? And so why do we set boundaries around ourselves? Do the work. Do the work that Jesus has given you to do. Do it in humility, true humility, which simply says, I'm doing my job. I'm loving. I'm caring. I'm defending the defenseless. I'm tearing down barriers instead of putting them up. And I suggest there are two sets of barriers that you need to tear down. Probably the same two sets I have. The set of barriers that you put around your heart and in your very spirit. That must be torn down so that your love can flow freely to each other. And not to each other in this room, but to each other in the world. Not a frivolous love, not that fanciful love, not that stuff and, wonderful music and delightful movies. No, not that kind of love. Hard love, real love, true love that says, you matter. Say it to yourself first, I matter. Say it for me, I want to hear it. I matter. I matter. Yeah, it's kind of hard to say for some of you. And I'm even guessing that for one or two of you all, in your own middle little acrobats, you deflected even saying that. Do the work. Do the work of Jesus Christ. And once you kind of wrestle with those boundaries and those hedges that you put around your own heart, at the same time we can wrestle with the hedges that the world wants to impose upon humanity. We want to frame human sexuality, what it looks like, who should have it and who shouldn't, and even the language that we use around it. Those are barriers. We want to put barriers around race. Who's worthy, who's not worthy? Are reparations something real? Are they not real? Oh, why should I do it? My folks weren't living here. My folks were in Long Island killing whales. Tear down these boundaries, social boundaries and personal boundaries. It's a lot of work. It's exhausting. Replenish yourself. Pray. Pray silently or aloud. Light a candle. It's a graphic image of your prayers raised to heaven. Go to an odd service that you hadn't planned on going to, like Ray's funeral. That's his anchor up there. Ray was a member of the church. He was an odd character. We celebrated his life yesterday. We celebrated the life of a great musician named Rhodes. Luigi was telling me it's a great story, and it's a story about community and what community ought to look like. You remember we started with that hospitality to strangers, entertaining angels thing? It's beautiful. So Luigi's from an Italian neighborhood in Chicago. Could you guess? His dog's name is Enzo. And we were talking, excuse me, there. We were talking about funerals. And we were talking about funerals and funeral homes, and I made my usual sarcastic thing. The beauty about having the funeral here at St. Anna's was its intimacy. And you didn't have to look down the hall and see those other people having their funeral down there. That awkwardness when you walk down the hall, you know. And Luigi said, oh, in my neighborhood, they'd have multiple funerals in the funeral home. We all knew each other. Oh, Rita died, I'm gonna come over and give my respects. Community was that big and that large that multiple funerals going on meant multiple gatherings of the community. I've seen that in some of the bars when some of our gay men have passed away. I don't see it as much as I used to, but I used to see these great celebrations of life in bar rooms, and they were wonderful. I've done 3 funerals at the Corner Pocket, and it was holy, and it was humble. And people let the barriers of their heart down, and they prayed, and when they prayed the Lord's Prayer, it was as sincere as I've seen any group of people pray it. I was humbled to be in a place where people thought they could not come to church. So we did church in their community. And it was beautiful. That's only one example of how we can begin to deconstruct these barriers, of how we can work ourselves into the world, how you can learn to love yourself because you have beauty. I'm telling you, you're beautiful. You're beautiful just as God made you. Not as someone told you, but as the Creator loves you. Love yourself. Stop deflecting it when I say love yourself. Embrace it. Receive it. It's my gift to you, and it is the gift of Jesus Christ to all of us. Amen.
Amen.